Hello and welcome back. Today we are doing the third part of the Psychology of Totalitarianism by Mattias Desmet. So far we've kind of touched on the foundation of totalitarianism. Well, in the last part especially, we talked about the four components that contribute to a totalitarianism regime. God, that word just gets so longer and longer every time you say it.
Yeah.
And we went over the regulation mania, the kind of how society implements so many rules and how that kind of starts to erode the fabric of society because people never act in like their genuine way and they start to resort to a kind of default, and then people provide that kind of default state, and how, you know, is this kind of subdued element of anxiety in society due to a number of reasons, and then a kind of reason for that is provided, and then that kind of buys people's trust and kind of loyalty, and then a solution is provided, and it kind of starts to feed into this totalitarian regime. So continuing on then into the next stage. So chapter 7, the leaders of the masses, ideological ideas. In the context of mass formation, the person disseminating the story is often ensnared by the narrative as well. In fact, their field of attention tends to be even narrower than that of the masses. This is primarily because the leader typically possesses a fervent belief in the ideological foundation underlying the narrative, rather than the narrative itself, that exercises control over the masses. And it's kind of what I was saying in the last part with, you know, the people who are so fanatical about an idea are normally the ones that are kind of put in charge. But to be so fanatical, you reduce the whole complexity of the world into this, like, you know, particular framework of how you see it. And you, like we were talking before, you know, you split it into this kind of binary world. It's like us against them. Mm-hmm. So unlike a conventional criminal who derives intrinsic pleasure from transgressing societal norms, in this case, totalitarian criminality resides more in the uncritical and thoughtless adherence to a system of totalitarian social rules, even when such a system becomes markedly inhumane and surpasses all ethical boundaries. This aligns with Hannah Arendt's renowned notion that totalitarianism reveals the banality of evil. It involves not monstrous individuals, but rather ordinary people who adhere to a morbid and dehumanizing way of thinking, or logic. Despite being under the grip of hypnosis and blindness, it is not accurate to claim that the totalitarian leader wholeheartedly believes everything that they convey to the population. In fact, the truth is quite the opposite. The leader's unwavering belief lies in the ideology they seek to impose, rather than the discourse they employ to promote it. Their fanaticism toward the ideology is so strong that they consider limitless manipulation, lies, and deception justified in order to realize it. According to their conviction, humanity, or a portion thereof, is on the path to attaining the best possible world, and thus anything becomes permissible. The essence of totalitarianism does not stem from utilitarian or selfish motives. Money and power are merely intermediate objectives. The ultimate aim is the actualization of an ideological fabrication, and the totalitarian leader is willing to blindly sacrifice their own interests to achieve this goal. This aligns with Le Bon's assertion that the leader of the masses themselves fall under the sway of hypnosis, particularly through their unwavering belief in the ideology they fervently embrace.
I mean, we did touch on this very briefly in the last podcast. We with the idea of, do people have ideas or do ideas have people, etc. And I thought it's super interesting the links between this and the Book of Evil by Roy Baumeister, because he obviously talks a lot about how, you know, one of the root causes of evil is this idea of like being ideological or idealistic about certain things, and therefore chasing an ideal at all costs can lead to, obviously, I guess, commitment of evil acts. You know, it's like the goal or the objective, the ideal is so great and so grand and so good that we can behave in any way possible to achieve it, even if it means like committing these acts that obviously could be seen as ethically, you know, difficult or, you know, evil in some respect, right? It's just, and then it becomes a case of just chasing that ideal at any cost, right? And then the thing is, once you take those steps, it justifies even more steps, right? It's like, I've already committed these things to achieve this goal. If I stop now, I've committed these things without achieving the goal, and therefore it makes it even worse. I then have to achieve the goal.
You have to follow through.
Be like, you know, committed all these acts, and I've like harmed all these people. It's like I still haven't hit that ideal state, and then I give up now. I've just committed those acts for no reason, I guess. Like it's, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. You can imagine the kind of cognitive dissonance that it creates within the person. And I thought this part was particularly interesting because, you know, as we touched on in the previous part, it's very easy to just assume that this person is malicious or nefarious, but it's almost like they come under their own spell, right? They start seeing the world in a particular way, and then they convince themselves that way that they see the world has to remain. And so they do everything in their way to kind of preserve that like perspective of the world. And it's just interesting because they almost, they're under their own spell.
And like, and I do think you're right with the level of dissonance. It'd be so interesting to like try and, what's the word, like piece together these disparate ideas that just don't work. Like I'm doing the greater good, but the evidence shows me I'm not. And therefore I have to like almost twist the logic to be like, but it doesn't matter that I'm doing all this harmful actions because the end goal is so grand and so great that, you know,
means to an end.
Everybody in the end, I'm going to be this hero because I've made the sacrifice that nobody else could. Because there is that like sort of like twisted logic that like I'm the one who's willing to make the sacrifice to cause the damage. It's a bit like almost like the Marvel, you know, Thanos philosophy. Like I'm the only one willing to restore balance to the universe, no matter what the cost. I'm the hero who's doing this because it's necessary, you know. And that is so funny because so many people, like I remember some people saying like how relatable this guy was, like the villain, because it was like the philosophy behind it isn't based upon evil, so people can actually relate to it in the sense of like, oh, I think this guy's doing it for the greater good. He's trying to save humanity, and people can understand that actually logic is inherently like attractive in some way. Like, I'm actually the guy who's willing to like make the sacrifice for the greater good. And as we said so many times before on this like podcast, especially when talking about manipulation and like power and stuff, like it becomes a problem when it's like, who is defining the greater good, and have we even discussed, is this actually the greater good, and at what cost, right? Like, well, right, we've created this idealistic, you know, super state of humanity where everybody's so happy and stuff, but we killed everybody apart from 1,000 or something. At what cost? At what, you know, at what point do we say, actually, hang on a second, this is not all right? Like the things we're committing to get to this state should not be committed regardless. You know, there's sort of principles here not to be sort of crossed.
It's actually terrifying. I think it's terrifying because you can see how easily it can get out of control, right? Like you just said, you know, people don't have ideas have people, and it's almost like particular ideas will find particular people, and those people will have such conviction in this end result, this solution that is supposed to bring them to, you know, nirvana, this like, you know, this ideal state, and it's their what's the word, their credulous belief, right, in pursuing this solution, and for some reason they think that it is the only solution, and so they denigrate any other solutions that could be put forward. And people like to follow people who are confident, right, and who have belief and show that they are willing, like you said, to sacrifice for this like goal. And it almost makes it, by sacrificing, right, it almost looks like, well, then maybe this is worth going for because this person's willing to put in the effort to go there. And it's just terrifying how, like, you know, this person will then come under their own spell and convince themselves, and before you know it, it's like it can get way out of control, way out of hand.
I think what's also quite interesting is if we link this back very much to the beginning of the book with this like mechanistic ideal of worldview and science, it's like, because we've progressed so much over the past, they almost use this idea that like, because we managed to manipulate, I guess, physics, so to speak, to create such great technological progress, such as planes, etc., and manage certain things, we then believe we have the power of God, right, that we can then manipulate things to create the ideal society. And I think that's a really interesting like dynamic of how we've come from this, and you can kind of see the logical like extension of it, like over time. Like it's like, okay, now we've managed to like manipulate certain things to create energy. We've created energy, which has created this. We're now in control of the universe to some degree. And therefore the logical extension of that is, if we can control that, why can't we control societies? Why can't we control this and create these results, right? But I guess one of the main points of the mechanistic worldview, these obviously like the more human worldview, is mechanistic stuff doesn't have like a will, an intention, therefore it can be manipulated, whereas humans can't. And this actually reminds me, we should definitely go on to this book at some point in the future. Did I ever tell you about like John Gray's book called like Straw Dogs, where he basically tells, we should definitely review it because it's quite a short one, but it's quite poignant on this sort of subject, where it's like, we've come to believe that science is progress and that humanity will always progress. Whereas his argument is, we haven't actually progressed that much. We've progressed in the sense of being able to manipulate physics and stuff, etc. Right? But the morality aspect of humanity has actually gone backwards. That's what his point is. 100%. And he's like, because we've forgotten about religion and actual ethics, we've like chased like progress being like progress is always going to continue, without realizing that actually we've actually gone backwards in terms of like moral progress. Let's just put it that way. And I think it's a really interesting like read, and we should definitely touch on it. On absolutely. The podcast. It's right up this sort of like idea. We can definitely do that at that point.
We've kind of focused on the how and not the why. We can do all these amazing things, but also it doesn't mean that we have to do them, right? It's almost like,
or what we should do with them. I mean, Oppenheimer, for example.
But that's literally what I was going to say.
Go.
Exactly. The whole like nuclear bomb thing. It's like, we've created it, but it doesn't mean like we have to use them. And it's almost like by working on this how, or this manipulation of the world, we've, like you said, we've left the reason behind. And it's like this discrepancy is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We can do so much now. I mean, like, it's half the issue that I have with psychology is that, what is psychology used for today? Okay, you have some therapists, but realistically, it's like for marketing and to try and sell products and to try and manipulate and persuade people. It's not for like the greater good, or because there's no reason behind it, right? And so if there's no reason, then it can just be used for at anyone's will. And most of that is like, well, we live in a capitalist society, so let's try and build a company that will do well. And I'm not saying it's all bad, but the point is that there's nothing to like root us. There's no value to push for other than like, well, I want to climb the social ladder. I want to do well. I want to acquire more resources.
To root us back from like more at like, at any cost almost,
If you had like a huge value for community and like building, like helping people around you, and it was rooted in that, then you could imagine how all these disciplines would be used for kind of, betterment. But
yes. Right, we'll move on. Otherwise, we could easily like sort of riff on that for like, I don't know, 30, 40 minutes. So let's just continue and then we'll see where we get to. So, imposing the ideology. So, the insatiable drive of totalitarianism to impose a rigid logic on society is evident in his obsession with symbols. These symbols serve various purposes, sometimes as distinguishing features for the privileged elite, such as uniforms, medals, and badges, and at other times as stigmatizing marks for the objectified enemies of the regime, which are forcibly engraved onto their flesh if deemed necessary, as seen in Auschwitz with the tattooed numbers, or the distinct signs assigned to different groups in the gulags. Through its system of signs, totalitarianism seeks to imprint its own logic onto reality, striving to permanently bind it to the real world. Notably, the assignment of signs and stigmas often marks the initial step in the process of destruction.
That's interesting, isn't it?
It's also like, once again, it's like pinpointing rituals or signs that somebody's an enemy, for example, right? Like it kind of reminds me a little bit of like but once again, this stuff's not actually just used for like totalitarianism. It's used as like culture war strategies as well. Like if you think about what's going on in America and in fact the world with the culture wars and stuff on the left and right, a lot of this stuff is like you're being signposted by being, oh, you're not supporting BLM on social media, therefore you're this. Do you kind of get what I mean? We've resorted to this very much like label behavior or label action as the enemy, etc. Right? It's like I don't think it's like strictly based upon totalitarianism, these techniques, but obviously they're used in this situation to create these like divisions, right? Like labeling is there to create these divisions, like you're this. But we said this about the Granfalloon yesterday. We can create a shared identity. We're the blue shirt boys or whatever. We're the people who do this, or we can create the opposite, which is like, oh, you're the people who do this, or you do that. Like you're these people. and then you create a division immediately by using these labels, right? And then from there you
100%.
reinforce it based upon behaviors, rituals, whatever.
And I think what's interesting is, if you're trying to, well, we say this as if there's like so much active intention to implement a totalitarian regime, which isn't the case. It kind of almost manifests, like they said, from like a psychological level. But I think what's interesting is, for a structured perspective of the world to be implemented into society, it needs to find a place where it can sit. And this almost suggests that, like, where there is ambiguity, it can be placed upon, and it changes the meaning of things. And so something that might have had like a completely different meaning, let's take the swastika, right? And then it can like be used, and it kind of changes the meaning of it, and it almost morphs it into something else. And it's just, you can see how it can kind of seep into society and find the areas where there is ambiguity. Because you could say, yeah, there's the blue shirt boys, but then it's like, well, what if we define what the blue shirt boys are? The blue shirt boys are these kinds of people. And so you kind of change where there was room for it to be manipulated. It found it, and it kind of like works its way in. Yeah.
No, it is super interesting how you can create like a shared identity, and then create the like meaning behind the shared identity by like giving like, I don't know, instructions, probably not the right word, but like ideals to live up to within that identity.
Yeah.
Like if you think about like the swastika stuff, obviously we now know it's like obviously how it ended up with Hitler and Stalinism, Nazi Germany, etc., right, and stuff. It's so interesting because at the time, for them, that symbol, for the people who believed it, was like a shared identity that they all wanted to live up to, right? That they thought was strong, and great. And the symbol for them was different, obviously, the symbol now.
I mean, the original symbol is a Buddhist symbol for peace, right? Like, and then it, like you said, it just took on a whole different meaning over time. It's like this, as the the perspective changed, the regime changed, so did the kind of meanings behind.
Well, I guess the actions of the people who wore the banner changed the meaning of it, right? You know, it's one of these things that over time, a bit like symbols take on the meaning that people assign to it, right? It's like we just said there, it didn't originally intend to be like that, but I guess obviously over time it slowly morphs and changes depending upon the actions. So totalitarianism represents the ultimate endeavor to eradicate uncertainty by retreating into pseudo-scientific certainty and merciless logic, attempting to reduce symbols to mere signs and seeking to annihilate any form of cultural diversity. It ruthlessly eliminates such diversity through various means. The systematic and industrialized transportation, exploitation, and extermination of specific population groups in labor and extermination camps serve as a harrowing historical examples etched deeply into our collective memory. The logic of a totalitarian system is in a constant state of flux and typically becomes increasingly absurd. The raison d'etre of such system lies in part in channeling anxiety, which necessitates the perpetual identification of new objects of fear and apprehension. In recent decades, we have witnessed the emergence of numerous sources of anxiety in our society, appearing at an accelerating pace and leading to a growing encroachment on civil liberties. Whether it be terrorism, climate change, or the coronavirus, these objects of anxiety drive the constant demand for new actions and perpetuate an endless cycle of threats, as exemplified by the proliferation of coronavirus variants, necessitating the introduction of new measures during the ongoing crisis. Mass formation feeds on anxiety and aggression without the fear and prospect of venting this aggression. The mass dynamics grind to a halt. The leaders realize this. If this happens, the masses will wake up and become aware of the damage they have suffered, whereupon they will turn against the leaders in a lethal fashion. Consequently, the leaders have no choice but to keep identifying new objects of anxiety, introducing new measures to destroy such objects. And it's funny, isn't it? Because the one thing I was thinking of here, that it's funny how the transition from Corona went straight into war, went straight into inflation, straight into like all these other objects.
The environment.
But less so. Obviously the environment's always been like a pretty big topic in the last, even before coronavirus, the environment was a big thing. But I think it's so interesting how
it's one crisis to the next.
Yeah, like how it became the war, which then became inflation. But the funny thing is, the thing that the governments aren't telling you about the inflation stuff is that wasn't caused by the war, but it was caused by their monetary policies during the coronavirus, which was always going to result in high inflation, which now has resulted in really high interest rates, which has resulted in all the shit that you're seeing. And it's funny because what they'll do, once again, objects of anxiety, they have a perfect thing to blame it on. The war. It's like, it's nothing to do with the fact that we printed loads and loads of money. It's nothing to do with that. It's nothing to do with stop the economy for like,
But this is the red herring over here.
It's nothing to do with all this stuff that, obviously is going to cause some sort of damage in the long run. But it's just the war. It's just when you just like, I don't know, like this, like I said, I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but when you just sort of think about that, it's just so it's just bullshit.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. But I tell you what, when you were reading that, what it reminded me of was 1984, when they constantly change who they're at war with. Yeah. And they'll be like, oh, no, we were never at war with these people. We're at war with these people. And they just change it. And it's like, oh, now we're at war with these people. And it's almost like just as the people are starting to like, that crisis is starting to leave their mind, there's another one,
Yeah, but it's also funny. There's a really good book. So first of all, I think we've both read this together, The Metaphors We Live By. Have you done that one?
I've read some of it, yeah.
And then there's also The Words That Work, and they're both about like language and communication in governments. So The Metaphors We Live By is very much like you can frame stuff in a metaphor, right? So the moment you say something's a war, it conjures up ideas of like a battle against the enemy and stuff. So by framing something as a war, you immediately there's like sides and there's a battle and it's hard. You bring up connotations that that would be different if you're like, it's like a dance. I think that's like the prime example they give. Like if stuff's like a dance, it's more like you're in harmony, you're trying to like match each other's moves, right? But a war is very much like brutal. And I just find it so funny how they have stuff like, this is the war on inflation, the war on this, the war on that, as if the enemy, which is inflation, wasn't caused by the people who are telling you are at war with it. It's almost like Frankenstein. It's like, we've created this monster and we're at war with it, but don't blame us. It's the monster that's terrorizing us, not the fact that we even created it in the first place. It's like, when I think about it, it's
insane.
It's relatively insane, but obviously they rely on people not being relatively informed in these sort of like things, especially of course, economics and stuff. It's like, people not understanding where inflation comes from. I was going to say inflammation. Inflation is essentially inflammation of the monetary system. So
it's funny. I've noticed, and I don't know whether this is something I've noticed or like, I'm not trying to be conspiratorial, but almost like since COVID, the notifications that I get about on BBC are all about like stabbings and like people, this person killed this person drowned her baby, and they're like really horrible stories. And they're happening all the time. I feel like it never used to happen that much. Maybe it still occurred that often, but it wasn't like promoted on the news that much. And it's almost like every day you're like, fucking hell, that's horrible. And it's almost like there's a crisis every day on a micro level, almost to keep you in that like state. And like, obviously I don't think it's like got that kind of nefarious plan behind it, but it does seem like, God, there is always something now. And even when we were reading Factfulness, the whole idea was like, you think the world is much worse because you're exposed to a lot of it now. And it's what sells, essentially. I mean, like clickbait titles or things that are like morally outrageous, they grab your attention. But I feel like, you could easily stoke someone's like anxiety constantly by providing stories of that.
Yeah. So my understanding was the news have always been doing that, and that it's always been a case of like, people are really interested in the scary stuff, and people are interested in the stuff that grabs attention. And by definition, that type of stuff always will grab attention because it's like, absolutely, it's devoid from like what most people experience in their real life.
Yeah.
Maybe they do post more of it now, but maybe it's obviously the fact that now there's less of the coronavirus and stuff taking over the news cycle, so that you have to bring more of it back in. But right, but also another thing there could be another explanation, which is the fact that maybe these crimes are actually rising now because people are suffering, and they're, like we're saying here, like they got pent up aggression. They don't know where to channel it, and they're just channeling it into like,
it's manifesting in these ways.
I don't know, man. It's like one of those things that there probably is something to be said for it, and there's probably like an increase. It'd be really interesting to know the police data on all this stuff. And then it's so funny because all these books link as well, because then you think about how do, in fact, similar to this about the measuring stuff, how do they define certain things? Because I remember it's like how do you define crimes? Do they also detect crimes? Like there's also incentives in police to, like, for example, if they have like a certain amount of crimes they need to like do a month, whatever, they're then incentivized to, like, if it's a minor crime, to ignore it, to reduce the amount of crime. For example, if for example, the head of police, like, we need to reduce crimes in this city this month, like, it just makes sense that they might change the definitions of certain crimes to hit these targets. And once again, this is like Goodhart's law, whatever it is. So when you start measuring stuff, it ceases to become a good measure. And it's just, I don't know. There's always going to be imperfections. The moment you have humans and the moment you have measuring and quantification, there's always going to be like scope for people who have incentives to change the scope to reduce or to improve their performance, right? Like it's always going to happen. And therefore it's always interesting. In fact, another book we should probably cover on the podcast, Mixed Signals. I think I sent it to you.
Oh, I know the one. Yeah.
We were talking about this before. It's all about designing good incentives. So like taking into account that obviously, you know, if you incentivize something, you've got to get like a secondary effect. But then it's also designing incentives to like combat that. It's almost like doing like a logic tree. It's like if you do this, they're likely to do this. Okay, it's like, how do we combat that? We do this, whatever. But I feel like very relevant to this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so on to the next part.
Yeah.
So the search for paradise. There are many reasons to assume that totalitarianism starts from megalomaniac, albeit good, intentions. It aspires to no less than total transformation of society into an ideological ideal. For example, the racially pure society of Nazism, or the rule of the proletariat.
Yeah, proletariat, I think.
Yeah. Gosh. Under Stalinism. However, the creation of the paradise typically ends in an inferno. However, the real masters of the predicament are not the leaders of totalitarianism systems, but the stories and their underlying ideology. These ideologies take possession of everyone and belong to no one. Everyone plays a part. Nobody knows the full script.
Yeah, I mean, before we move on to the next chapter, I think it's quite interesting when it's like, so like you said, nobody knows the ending, but it's quite easy to see where they're going, these things, because it's like, what logical extension can you have from this? Like, if it's like these people are bad or whatever, and they need to be removed, or sorry, like these people are bad, and we can't achieve the ideal state with them in the world. I mean, if logically follows that at some point along the line, you're going to have to get rid of them, right? And this is kind of where I think you can foresee sometimes some of this like logic and how it plays out over time. It's like, if the world depends on not having these people around, at some point, the logic and that somebody who's going to take the story to the next logical step is going to be like, okay, right, well, we need to get rid of them then. You know, whether it's through mass deportation or like even worse, right? Like it's one of those things that like, if you just extend where they're already starting from, and like their arguments, you can usually find out where it's heading once they get into power and once this story, takes over. Yeah.
So I think on a large scale, yes, I think you can eventually kind of foresee the ending and
you can see how it could,
right?
Yeah.
But I think there's also an element of like unpredictability, especially when you're in it. It's very like, I think you can, in hindsight, you can look back and be like, oh, this is so obvious. This person was doing that and then he went on to do this. But I think when you're actually in it, it's very difficult to see how it's going to pan out. I mean, like during COVID, it was quite unpredictable. And I think, which he'll go on to in a minute, but he touches on the unpredictability of things, because to conform and assimilate reality into a totalitarian perspective of the world, you have to impose rules, because life is constantly changing and you have to almost trap it within a box. And so you have to keep changing the rules to be able to make it fit in the box. And that's why he talks about it in this book. And he also talks about like Stalinism, how every day the rules would change to the point where you didn't know what the rule was anymore. And so you almost just, instead of trying to go into a situation and be like, okay, I think I know the rules, you just didn't engage at all. I mean, even during COVID, we had the rules changed every fucking day. Today, you're allowed to go out for an hour. Tomorrow, you're allowed to go to the gym, this, that, and that.
Yeah. How much the rules changing as well could be because of the fact, for example, in the totalitarianistic like system, let's just say, how much of it is being changed because the ideal result isn't being hit, so they're like adapting almost. Do you kind of get what I mean? Like in the totalitarianistic state, let's just say it was the under Stalinism, they've already imprisoned all the old aristocracy, and obviously they hadn't reached this like nirvana or whatever. They hadn't reached the promised land. So then they're like, okay, right, somebody else is still causing some issues here, and that's when they went after sort of like the farmers, I think it was, or something like this.
Oh, anyone who's educated.
Yeah,
I mean,
they basically changed the rules.
The goalpost keeps moving.
Yeah, exactly. But based upon the fact that their goal hadn't been hit, if that makes sense. They were kind of like, we've done everything you said in the logical, system that we have, but we still haven't got there yet.
Yeah.
So what's stopping it? And then it's like, hang on a second. These guys are very similar to these old bad guys.
Yeah.
Let's go after them. They're like, they're like their brothers and sisters or whatever, you know. It's like, oh.
No, but absolutely, because the thing is that you can't know that there isn't an outcome, because life is forever changing and fluid, and it's unpredictable to an extent. So you can try and morph it into this kind of like process of getting to a goal, but that goal will always move, and you can never reach it, right?
And also because it's technically an unattainable goal, because any ideal state kind of really is to some degree. You're always going to eventually get to the point where you're like, okay, right, we haven't got there yet. So there has to be something else we need to change to get there.
Exactly.
But I feel like there's no, like, you're saying there's like rule changes, which there is, but there's not like drastic rule changes.
No, it's not like, on a very like small level.
It's not like you know, all of a sudden it's like, actually we were wrong. We just killed all these people.
Yeah.
God damn it. Like, they're the actual heroes here. It's more like less a logical extension of these people who we persecuted. Let's add more to the bucket list almost, or like.
But that's where, like, you know, during Stalinism, you used to have the rules changed so much, and you never know whether you were going to be put on the list to basically just be executed. How do you act if you don't know, if the rules are changing every single day and you can't keep up with all the rules? Then what do you do? Well, I guess you kind of just sacrifice yourself to this system and to their belief, and that you'll always be on their side, because there's no other way to like navigate living anymore, right? And you can understand how it kind of would introduce like a level of like subdued anxiety the whole time, because you're like, I don't know what to do, I don't know what's right or wrong, I don't know what's illegal anymore.
And that makes it even worse, right? Like, it makes it even,
and I think also, like, even let's say you do get to the goal, right, which is, let's say we want all the old aristocracy in jail or to, you know, be executed. But once again, like they just said before, you always need to go from one crisis to another. If it was to stop, then what? Have you won? Are you at your utopia? You're not at your utopia. And so you need to constantly provide another reason why you're not there yet. And so the goal, like you said, the goalpost shifts. And now it's like, oh, well, these people are very similar. Let's go for them. They're the ones who are causing all the issues in society now. And then it just keeps, you know,
before, just a quick one before we move on to like the next chapter. It kind of reminds me of like the individual psychology of people, you know, is like always trying to attain a goal, which then moves, because once you attain the goal, the happiness only lasts a few seconds, right? Because like, as we know from like the dopamine books, is like most of the pleasures in the pursuit. So it kind of reminds me of like a collective version of this exact like biological mechanism, which is like, let's chase for this goal, and we kind of get there and we realize, oh shit, like it's not the ideal state we thought it would be. So there's got to be something that's stopping it from being to this like expectation we had. And therefore it's constantly like changing it, because it's like, you're never going to get to that point, because the thing about humanity is once you get to that goal, that point, you always want something more, right? Like it's just a collective like manifestation of the individual, but at like a greater scale, right? Like in that sense, or similar. It's not probably direct, but it's a similar manifestation, I think.
Exactly. And I think that then it would frame your approach, your agenda, because if you're realizing you're not getting to your point B, then you'll start looking for why not? And realistically, you'll probably resort to the next thing that like you didn't like, right?
Once again, then people who are controlling the narrative might put in their personal like biases into like, oh, this is the group, whatever, which I'm sure is probably what happened in these, you know, these situations, right?
Yeah.
But you're right. It's also a lot easier to like point outwards than inwards when it comes to this. Like, oh, so what's the problem here? Is it my plan? No, because we've already committed, as we said before, all these atrocities. It can't be the plan. It's got to be somebody else or something else. It's dangerous. Anyway, so this is a good chapter as well. So chapter 8, conspiracy and ideology. So if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, it would necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I can't remember how it's pronounced.
Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah. Because I know Peterson references.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
But it kind of does make sense that we're all like, we've spoken about it so many times, how we're like capable of both good and evil. And that's kind of what this quote gets to. It's like, so Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he was in the Gulag, wasn't he, for Stalinism, etc.
Yeah.
And I remember him like sort of realizing that actually the people who are committing these crimes actually were technically good people in other aspects of their life as well. So it's like the line between good and evil is like very, very fine.
Yeah.
And like we said, like a lot of these people who commit these atrocities from the evil book, Roy Baumeister and stuff, is very much like they think they're doing good, almost.
Yeah.
And like, we're all capable of these evil actions, because if we were in that point where we're doing it, we usually think we're doing it for the good. So therefore we are capable of committing it. Like, I remember as well, like commentary, I think, on evil, where he's talking about how most people who commit sort of like really nefarious crimes, for example, genuinely believe they're the good guy in their story. Like, they don't think of themselves, like, when they ask them, like, are you a bad person? Like, no, I'm a good person. You know, nobody actually goes out there and goes, I am so evil, like, I'm the worst human being, I'm despicable, you know?
Yeah. That's exactly, that's what they were trying to portray as, like, this the media's idea of evil, that people just want to, like, you know, inflict evil upon the world and suffering, but actually that just doesn't really exist. And it kind of coming back to your point about Thanos, you know, the most relatable and likable villains are ones who you can kind of understand where they're coming from. Right. Because it's like, oh, you're not so far off the map that I can't understand why you're there. But I can, you know, for the villains that can, you're like, okay, I can see where you're coming from. Which is weird. I don't want to resonate with that, but actually, you know,
I do. These are like the deep sort of like thriller movies or psychological thrillers that people are like, oh wow, that villain was like deep. Whereas, you know, the classic other villains, like, I don't know, the sort of James Bond stuff where they're just like, I'm out for world domination, and like you don't really know like a backstory of why they're there, and it's, you kind of look at it and you just go like, oh, I get why he's against you. Like, I get why James Bond's fighting you, whatever, or like everybody's against you. But I don't get why you're doing it. Oh, I just want power, world domination. Okay, maybe, but like there still needs to be more context to it, I think, for people 100%. To really, like you said, relate to it. And I think that's why people love these sort of like documentaries sometimes, of like thrillers or like jail and stuff, and they get to really understand these people as well. It's like, oh wow, this is like, there's more to this than just, I don't know, like you said, the caricature in the media. This person just wants to inflict harm. Don't get me wrong, there's some masochists out there, people who actually do, like, who find pleasure in it. But like the main point from that evil book was like, most people who are evil aren't out there just to inflict pain. They are literally thinking they are the hero in their story. And as we see, like, you know, we're capable of self-deception to like extreme levels, right? Especially when we talk about this like cognitive dissonance of like, how do I fit the two together, that I've acted this way, but at the same time I've acted this way so many times, that's good. How do I put the two together? You come up with a reason for your bad behavior. You know, it's like, oh, I had to do that because of this, this, and this.
Absolutely. I think it's just funny. Like a prime example would be the Joker film, the recent one. That so many people resonated with, because it was like, okay, wow, there is like a large portion of society that is kind of neglected and is just left, and, you know, it builds resentment to these other classes, and it was like weirdly relatable. And so you kind of like, okay, he's horrible, but at the same time it's like, you know, he's touching on a
you can understand how his like transformation happened, like, you know, because he wasn't horrible actually originally, was he?
No, he wasn't. He was exactly a nice guy. He just got like completely neglected and, you know, oppressed and
so the question of whether the leaders of the masses are conspirators and whether mass formation and totalitarianism are orchestrated by a secretive few is a valid inquiry. Throughout history, there have been instances where leaders of the masses have been perceived as conspirators. As the influence and power of the masses grew during the 19th and 20th centuries, conspiracy theories emerged as attempts to understand complex social dynamics and mass formations. These theories aim to provide explanations for the intricate forces operating within society. I don't know if you want to continue on, and then I feel like we can comment on it afterwards, because I feel like this could all build, and then we'll just dump on it.
I love this chapter. Conspiracy theories. In present times, the term conspiracy theory is often used loosely, even in cases where theories do not involve any mention of a conspiracy. Therefore, it is important to establish conceptual clarity and define the term accurately. According to Wikipedia, conspiracy refers to a secret plan or agreement between persons for an unlawful or harmful purpose, while keeping their agreement secret from the public or from other people affected by it. This definition highlights three essential characteristics that must be present for an activity to be characterized as a conspiracy. 1, there must be conscious, intentional, and planned effort. 2, this effort must be hidden or kept secret. And 3, the endeavor must be aimed at causing harm, indicating a malicious intent towards individuals involved.
Before we go, so should we consider mass formation the result of a conspiracy? So the perception of a conspiracy in mass formation is not solely attributed to the coordinated actions and behaviors of the crowd. It is also influenced by the threatening nature of the crowd's intentions, as it seeks to assert control and impose its will upon society. Throughout history, this desire for control has been evident, but it may have been more apparent as crowds have gained a more enduring presence and exerted a continuous influence on society. For individuals who are not caught up in mass formation, the phenomenon initially appears bewildering and absurd. They feel a sense of threat from its dominant and controlling appearance, as well as its intolerance towards those who do not participate. In such a state, these perplexed observers often develop a strong yearning for a simplified framework that allows them to comprehend the complexity of the situation. They seek a way to mentally manage this anxiety and intense emotions that arise. Interpreting mass formation in terms of conspiracy fulfills this need by reducing the overwhelming complexity of the phenomena into a more manageable and comprehensible frame of reference.
The allure of conspiracy. A simple frame of reference offered by conspiracy thinking allows individuals to mentally manage their anxiety by linking it to a single object, typically a group of intentionally deceitful individuals perceived as the elite. This externalization of the blame enables the redirection of frustration and anger towards the singular object. The inclination towards fanatical conspiracy thinking reveals the innate human tendency to seek someone to hold responsible in the face of adversity, serving as a target for aggression. This inclination aligns with a broader psychological rule. The greater the anger people experience, the more they perceive intentional malice. Similar to mass formation, conspiracy theorizing instills a sense of enthusiasm in the individuals. The association of anxiety, anger, and discontent with simplified mental images transforms a strongly negative state into a seemingly positive one. Everything becomes explainable through a straightforward frame of reference, imbuing the world with logic and providing a target for frustration and anger. This absolves individuals of responsibility and alleviates the need for self-reflection. Conspiracy logic often veers off course, gradually descending into the realm of the absurd, even among highly intelligent and rational individuals. Fundamental distrust underlies the assumption that anything endorsed by the mainstream must inherently be incorrect. For example, if the mainstream narrative supports the idea of a round Earth, conspiracy thinking may assert it to be flat. Additionally, conspiracy thinking tends to dehumanize specific groups, occasionally resorting to literal dehumanization by portraying the elite as reptiles or aliens.
Classic. Cool, we'll just continue on, then we'll reflect on it in a second.
Yeah.
So, grand plans and rationality. Throughout history, humans have succumbed to various temptations such as the illusion of rational understanding and control, resistance to critical self-questioning, and the pursuit of short-term convenience. Initially seen as dangerous within the religious discourse, these temptations later become embedded in the dominant narrative, serving as their own justification with the rise of mechanistic thinking. This is perhaps the most direct and concrete illustration of Hannah Arendt's thesis that ultimately totalitarianism is the symptom of a naive belief in the omnipotence of human rationality. And to that's so true. It's like we become like God and we think we can control things. So therefore, the antidote to totalitarianism lies in an attitude that is not blinded by a rational understanding of superficial manifestations of life, and that seeks to be connected with the principles and figures that are hidden beneath these manifestations. Leaders and followers alike were enthralled by the seemingly boundless possibilities offered by the human mind. The evolution towards a highly controlled technological society characterized by the pervasive surveillance appears inevitable, as long as the human mind remains trapped in this logic and is unconsciously influenced by these attractors. It is this ideology that reshaped society, established new institutions, and identified new figures of authority. In line with this ideology, institutions were formed to devise plans for the future structure of society and its response to crises. For example, publications like Klaus Schwab's COVID-19 The Great Reset outline such endeavors. For many people, these events and publications serve as definitive evidence that current social developments are orchestrated and the result of conspiracy. However, when we consider the definition of conspiracy a secret, planned, intentional, and malicious scheme, we immediately observe two things. Firstly, these plans are hardly a secret as they are openly accessible on the internet. Secondly, it is questionable whether these plans dictate the discourse and actions of experts through targeted instructions. The communication of experts is often riddled with contradictions, inconsistencies, retractions, corrections, clumsy wording, and transparent errors. The discourse among experts lacks consistency except for one overarching trend: the continuous push towards a society increasingly controlled by technology and biomedicine, aligning with the ideals of the mechanistic ideology. Consequently, we observe similar issues in the coronavirus crisis, as those exposed by replication crisis and academic research. Both scenarios reveal a complex web of errors, carelessness, and biased conclusions, where researchers unconsciously affirm their ideological principles. I mean, yeah, just it's so interesting because
it really is.
I do see it with this one more than this sort of explanation for the conspiratorial sort of mindset as well. It makes a lot of sense, you know, like when things, especially when you know people control things such as mass media, right? When you know there's people behind it who want to promote certain messages, you then immediately think there's like this mass, you know, like collaborative effort, which there is in some aspects, in the sense of like governments are talking to each other. But once again, this all boils down to the fact that they also believe that they're doing the greater good for humanity. And it's not like a collective effort of like, we're going to screw over the general population. They're doing it from a sense of we're trying to protect them based upon the information we have or whatnot, right?
Yeah.
And I just find it so interesting that he's got such a good point here. It's like, if it was a conspiracy, why would they literally put out a book being like, this is what we plan, or we plan for the future? Like, but the thing I do, like the thing that makes the most sense, which is what he explained behind it all, was this idea that we're slowly moving towards it because the ideology that underpins the entire society, the idea of the mechanistic society and the idea that we can control things, is the actual underpinning of all of this. It's not the classic, you know, these people have the ideas. The idea literally has the society. It's like, if we can get the data, if we can get if we can find ways to manage certain areas of this society, we can create this ideal society. We can use it to make us better. And once again, it's from a position of like, I guess, love and like, we want to improve things, but then it's like defining what the improvement is in the first place is the debate. It's not any other way around, is it? But at the same time, people up higher, which is why I think we think of this as like they're conspiring against us. They're making decisions for the collective based upon what they believe the best is. And people don't have a say in it. And that is where I think this like battle between, I guess what you could say is the people who control the planet in the sense of they're in the governments against the everyday individual, in my head at least.
No, I think it's a really interesting point. Like, I loved his point that he was saying, you know, the more frustrated and angry you are about something, then the more likely you are to attribute it to a single object, someone to blame, essentially. And I think, you know, when there are individuals who run such, you know, huge companies like, you know, the media, for instance, what's his name, the Australian guy, Murdoch, you know, it's very easy to be like, okay, well, he's trying to force his, you know, perspective of the world on everyone through this like kind of top-down system. But I think, like you said, it's more a manifestation of the ideology that we have adopted, which is this kind of mechanistic ideology. And playing devil's advocate, I wonder whether, obviously, you know, he's defined conspiracy in a particular way. So there has to be like three components, and one of them being that it has to be malicious, right? There has to be a malicious intent. But I wonder whether conspiracies start out small, as in it is literally a conspiracy when it is first starts, but when the masses start to take on the very ideology that conspiracy is rooted in, then does it need to be secret anymore? Can it not evolve to a point where, okay, we know that people think this way about this particular subject. Why do we need to be secret about it? And so it kind of evolves into this, because I wonder whether there's like almost a different form of conspiracy, which is like being outright open about it, you know? And and it's, once it's out there, and so you've kind of got that, I don't know, it's just if it resonates with people, then it's not so much a conspiracy anymore, and people are starting to buy it.
So I got only a couple of thoughts on that. So I just remember there's that book. I don't think it's called Conspiracy. It might even be just called Conspiracy. Remember the one I told you about? It defined conspiracy slightly differently. It kind of made it out like an actual conspiracy theory is one where you can never be like disproven. It's almost like any evidence proves it. So it's like, if you, I mean, I think he gave an example a bit earlier on when he's saying something like, where was it? Conspiracy, for example. Yeah. So if the mainstream narrative supports the idea that it almost proves evidence that they're trying to push it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like it proves the conspiracy because it's like doing what they say. And then if it did start saying other stuff, they'd be like, oh, it proves it anyway because they're trying to kid us into believing this or whatever. So like it is irrefutable logic or whatever.
Yeah.
So that changed it, because I also do think it's interesting to have the conspiracy theory of being like, it has to have malice, like bad intent.
Yeah.
What about, surely it just has to have self-interest.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to have malintent. It
Exactly.
can just be like a bunch of people collaborating for self-interest.
Yeah.
That's still a conspiracy in my head. Like, if that makes sense. Like, it doesn't have to have the, because obviously if you define it as the malicious intent, you just remove everything, because these people aren't doing it for malicious intent.
Yeah.
Like you said before, if they're like a human being, they probably think they're the good guy in some form or another.
Yeah.
So they're doing it for good intent, but it still doesn't not make it a conspiracy or like they're in cahoots.
Yeah.
They're still collaborating behind the scenes. And like you said, maybe once it gets to the point where it's already set in motion, who needs to hide it anymore? You might as well put it in plain sight and be, look, I'm being honest. So I can see that. And then another thing I was going to say was, a lot of it could also be said to be these changes. Once again, we were saying before, it's like the ideology behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say it's also like the systems behind it too. Like the systems create the result. So it's like these people are being placed into systems that already exist, and they're just following these structures of the incentives within these systems, such as the accumulation of capital or costs, you know, like stuff like that. So it's like Murdoch as an example, right? He controls the media, but he's not creating stuff in my head for the malicious intent to harm people. He's probably pursuing ideas or trying to disseminate ideas that serve his self-interest. Yeah, which once again could also be seen as malicious intent, because it's like, what is malicious intent to some degree apart from being so self-interested? Do you get what I mean? But
it's you know, in that book Evil, they described it as evil is in the eye of the victim, right? And it's the same thing. Like, maliciousness is in the eye of the victim to an extent, because you don't know whether their intentions behind it were malicious or not. And I think, like you said, systems are. I 100%. I think you are a product of the system that you're in, and if
and the cultural beliefs or whatever that the system provides or whatever.
100%. And so if that system holds certain beliefs about the world, which will be natural and will probably reflect the people who are at the top, and it kind of trickles down. But as soon as the system is kind of shaped in that way, anyone who joins into that system kind of becomes a product of it. And so whether they've intentionally gone along with it, but it's just
like, it's not by design, right? Like,
no, absolutely not.
To be fair, people are making, I guess, intentional decisions within the system, but the system itself guides the actual intention and what gets rewarded, etc. Right? So this is where I guess this is why people argue against sort of or trying different systems or changing policies, etc. Because these are the things that actually guide the actions of the people within the world, right? To some degree, like, or you are, like you said, constrained by the system, by the culture, which is informed by the system, which is also technically all underpinned by the ideology of this. Like, you know, we can control things, we can make material progress, we can, you know. And this is why I found this book, I guess, so fascinating at the end, because it kind of like starts at the beginning, builds up a massive narrative from like how these things like that deeply underlie everything we think now have come to like lead to this level of thinking, which has come to like this conspiracy stuff as well. And I thought the point you made there about the evil was so interesting, was the idea that whenever somebody gets something committed against them, they always search for that evil projection first. Remember I said to you ages ago, I always thought the invention of evil was a way of trying to get a bunch of people to support you against somebody. Like, it kind of is, because it's that thing, like, somebody commits something to you, you ignore the fact that it could be like a completely like an accident, right? It could be completely unintentional. But you're more likely to just assume it's intentional, or the attribution bias, because this person's a bad person. Rather than, because the situation, he was late for work. Let's just say somebody ran over a kid, right, by accident, right? Or he was late for work and like he was absolutely panicking, whatever. Like, there's no excuse anyway. But different to like, he just molded down because he's a horrible human being. And like the first sort of conclusion most people like make, sort of thing, careless, drunk, whatever. They jump to these conclusions because it fits that narrative of like, somebody's committed something that's bad, so they have to be evil. Like, somebody's done something that's like harms other people, it has to be intentional, whereas half the time it can be completely unintentional. Like, somebody goes in and slide tackles somebody, football, breaks their leg, whatever, like the intent was to take the ball, not to break the person's leg.
But that's exactly it. And I think, you know, on a societal scale, we have moved towards this this way of thinking whereby we overlook the intentions, right? As in, like, that's racist, that's homophobic, where it's like, but the result looks like that, but you're interpreting that and making it fit into this particular way that you see the world. But actually, you have to look at the intention. And it's the same thing that goes for, like, presume, like, you know, that old adage that goes, presume innocent until proven guilty, right? But we don't do that anymore. We jump straight to, like, I saw the result and I know that that's bad. And he tried to break that guy's leg. And it's fascinating how And I think that's all kind of underpinned to a degree in like this kind of mechanistic ideology, trying to find like a way that it fits into this way of seeing the world and having like one person to blame, an object to kind of
like
blame.
Cause effect in a very linear fashion rather than sort of like a multivariant fashion, you know, like less chaotic in terms of like chaos theory, these, you know, sort of like linear like reactions, like this causes this, causes this, causes this, when in reality is like this is caused by like 10 different things.
Absolutely.
All have different levels of like causation, right? Like it's you know,
no,
it's never quite like, oh, I did this, so I did like this happened. I mean, it is to some degree. Like I stood in front of a car and it hit me. That's because I stood there. But what caused that? There was the fact I was late for my work, the fact that I had my AirPods in, I couldn't hear stuff. Do you know what I mean? There's like 3 or 4 different things that all came together to create that action. It's contributions, not causation. Like, that makes sense.
100%.
But it links to the communication books. Can you remember that? Because it was never like, it was like when you speak with somebody and you try and find what's happening. It's like, don't look for like single causes. Let's just both talk about how we both contributed to this problem.
It
is always about.
It's always going to be that. It's never going to be so simple. But we do that. It's almost like our default for our brain to like try and reduce the complexity of things into some simple solution, because then it's like
a conspiracy theory. Like these bad guys are controlling everything and causing this. When it's like, well, actually, there are people out there probably acting in a way that's not good for society, but it's caused by all these different things that we can't see.
100%.
Like, they're juggling different problems. They're juggling completely different situations. They believe something completely different, and therefore they're going to act in a completely different way to how we would. And therefore it's not just one thing. It's not like they're so evil and that's the only reason they want to cause harm to us. It's more like they've grown up and they believe this. They've seen this. This has happened in their life. This is the situation they find themselves in. This is the system they find themselves in. You know, everything kind of leads into this one thing where they're like, okay, now I'm going to make a decision to do this. And then that affects everybody, right? But it's a lot sexier to be like, oh, that guy's like a douchebag. Like, he's
of course, and it's also,
because then the solution is simple. It's like, kill him.
That's the point. As in, like, what's the following action? Because it's easy to make an action off one particular, like, this is the cause. This is 1 + 1 = 2. If there's so many things you have to factor in, then it makes it really complicated. And, you know, we build systems for efficiency essentially at the end of the day, but it kind of reduces the complexity and just makes it like simple. It's fascinating. Another point on that actually that I was going to say is, I think, you know, these conspiracies or these actions that a lot of these systems or people are like engaging in, I think that they may all be like underpinned by a mechanistic ideology. But what I find interesting is that it may be a manifestation of their own individual personalities, which creates different types of like results. So there could be different types of conspiracies, but they may all be like, you know, have this mechanistic ideology, this kind of like end point, this focal point that they're aiming towards. But how it manifests is almost like a reflection of the person who kind of, or the system, the like culture or perspective of the world that they hold. Because, you know, you could argue that there was a lot of pent up aggression in Germany prior to World War II because of, you know, the fucking Treaty of Versailles, whatever it was called. Hyperinflation, massive like frustration and anger, like he was just saying before, looking for a particular object to blame all of that on. But Hitler was the one who provided this kind of attitude towards, well, it's the Jews. Now, is that a reflection of him who manifested, and it's still a mechanistic ideology, but it's a reflection of his attitude towards it. It could have so easily been something else, right? It could have been a different person.
You're right. He provided a different object to destroy. Like,
yeah.
It could have been like, oh no, it's actually, I don't know what else he could have said, but anything. It could have even just been like, it's the economic policies. Let's just change the economic policies, you know, and then everything's a bit.
It's Czechoslovakia that did all this. Like, let's blame it on them, you know. And it's interesting because that
it's funny actually. Because obviously, logical conclusion as well. They were blaming it on the Treaty of Versailles, which is fair enough. That's actually what the economic causation was caused by that, right? But like, it logically led to the war, like obviously over that time, because he was the one blaming it. It's a good point. It's a very good point actually, because it's so funny if you actually look as well. Like, for example, as well, right now, if inflation and stuff all blame on the war, therefore Putin's now the object of hate, and therefore it justifies any means at some point to potentially go and destroy Putin, like even if it requires nuclear. I'm not saying it'll ever get to that point. You kind of get what I mean? There is like a logical of this reasoning eventually. Like, somebody's head's going to be called for at some point. Like, why is this continuing to happen? Why is inflation continuing to happening? And as long as people keep deflecting the actual blame from themselves to other people, it logically concludes that something else is going to happen to these other people, not the change of policy, whatever. Because if the moment they go, oh yeah, it's actually our fault, it's our policy making, we have to change it, then actually their heads are going to be called for in the sense of like, you should quit your job right now because it's your fault. This is the
no, of course.
When it's something external, like it's a war which we're not even in, but we technically are. Like it's like we can't really do much, so our hands are tied. Like it's the perfect excuse.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, exactly.
So, anyway. We went off
fascinating.
I don't think we even finished the conspiracy.
No. So on to the next part then. So how ideology spreads. Remarkably precise and regular patterns can emerge when individuals independently adhere to the same simple behavioral rules, driven by shared attractors. It is the ideology rather than a secretive elite that wields ultimate influence. Instances that demonstrate how an ideology take hold of society are not evidence of a grand conspiracy, but rather reflections of this phenomena. Consider major reorganizations within large companies and government institutions where similar processes occur. Those in positions of authority who seek to restructure an organization will naturally make adjustments to align with their goals, and they will strategically place individuals who share their vision in key positions, basically what we were just saying. Through formal and informal means, they will shape minds and prepare them for the restructuring process. Those intimately involved in such endeavors are unlikely to perceive them as conspiracies. In fact, we can observe similar behavior in biological organisms as they attempt to shape their environment to suit their needs. And we're basically just saying that, the restructuring of like a system and how that kind of trickles down. And like you said, like earlier on when he said, when he was talking about science and how, where there are unscripted areas, right, that you can't follow a rule, your kind of unconscious biases will seep in. And in this situation, you can imagine how someone will be like, oh, I like Tom because he thinks similar to me, so I'm just going to put him as I'm going to make him COO or something like that, right? But there's no intent, there's no malicious intent there, or it doesn't sound like it. It's just he
funny,
sees the world.
It will be the unconscious part of like, I like this guy. Therefore, how they say you tend to hire people you like rather than people who are competent to some degree. Yeah. It's kind of like that. It's like, oh, I like this guy. He's very similar to me. He shares the same viewpoints. Therefore, we're going to hang out, and I want him to be part of my team. It's why likable people tend to end up go to like higher places. I think to some degree because it's like we get each other. He can adapt to me. He shows that he's similar to me. Like I want him around me. It's as simple as that, right? And it's not even like a calculated decision, I think. It's not like they're thinking this through like that. It's very much like I feel an emotion of like, I like this person, therefore I want them near me, kind of thing. Like how social bonds are made, right, between primates. It's like,
A prime example, an example that I'm thinking of is take Facebook, for example, right? And how popular, how successful they've been, and their attitude to in Instagram and all these other ones of like trying to capture people's attention. Okay, now obviously that's had loads of negative effects on society, but it's easy to be like, oh, they wanted to kind of erode society, or they wanted to influence the political campaigns, these kinds of things. But it's also interesting because a belief that you could hold about society, and one that comes up quite a lot, is, well, is it all on the user? Is it just them who needs better, better will to be able to just put their phone down, or is it on the company's half? Do they need to put in regulations to make sure that their users aren't abusing their platforms, right?
Okay, yeah.
And it's I think that's two different ways that you could view the world. And you could imagine Mark Zuckerberg being like, well, I think all users should, it's down to their control. I'm not forcing them to go on Facebook. I'm not forcing them to go on Instagram. It's
the exact same logic the cigarette companies and stuff use.
Yeah,
it's very, very much. And even the health diet sort of based stuff. The people who go at McDonald's are not forcing people to eat McDonald's, even though it's highly addictive. I'm not forcing people to smoke, even though it's highly addictive. Yeah. I'm not forcing people to go online, even though it's highly addictive. It's it's one of those things absolve responsibility. It's not my fault because these people have free will, free choice. But it's quite funny. What book was it? It's one of those habit books quite recently, I think. But they were talking about how actually there is a point. I think it might be The Power of Habit, where it was actually there comes a point where addiction is so strong that these people actually don't have a choice.
Oh yeah, no, exactly.
They have a way more constrained choice.
Yeah.
Or their power to abstain from this decision is gone, and therefore are they actually of free will? You know.
Yeah.
And therefore, at that point, surely Zuckerberg and stuff are to blame by providing this substance which causes it, or at least has some partial part. But then the whole world would never work completely well, because anybody who creates a product that the market loves and obviously gets addicted to, which is a lot of the most successful products in the world revolve around that like mechanism, would cease to exist to some degree.
Yeah. But you can see how it can manifest, right? Like you can almost imagine Mark Zuckerberg hanging out with some other guy and then like being irritated by like, oh, you know, the government's on our back saying that we need to change all this, but it's like, I'm not forcing them to do it. I'm not forcing them to go on Instagram. And so then, you know, he hires that guy because he has a similar belief. And you can see how the whole kind of system is starting to shape around like his kind of way of see the world, right? Like,
I guess one of the best ways of putting it is nobody likes to be reminded that they're like doing something bad as well.
Yeah.
So like, for example, if you're committing like these things that you said, like, or like there's the consequences of your actions, right? You like to think, oh, even though people have free will, but deep down, you know, like I'm sure these people know deep down, or there's some part of their consciousness which is aware that there could be an alternative viewpoint, which is like, this is bad. You're not going to want to surround yourself by people who remind you that what you're doing could be bad. So you're always going to surround yourself with yes men. Like if you think about it, I would do the same. Like if there's a part of me that I wanted to hide, I would, or felt ashamed of, let's just say, I would hate to be around somebody who consistently reminded me of it, even though that is actually what we need for like personal growth to some degree. We need that adversary who's going to remind us of our faults. Yeah. You know, who's like, it's almost like the funny, when you go back to the Bible and stuff, and like, when you think of the stories of like the devil's always in your ear, giving you the little sort of like, oh, you're right, don't worry about it. Like, everything's okay. Like whispering sweet nothings in your ear. Mm-hmm. And then there's always these sort of like the hard coming, like God who just gives you the sort of like, here's the truth. And you always reject it because that point it hurts, you know, and it depends how far down the line you are. You know, if you've already committed, like we said before, all these actions for the ideology, and if somebody sits at a board meeting and says, oh, by the way, you've just killed this many people. Yeah. You're like, well, go away. Like,
get the fuck out.
Yeah.
Who the fuck are you? You know, like, it's true. And like, that's a good point about like how much you've actually invested already, because you're going to go back on all of that.
We can't, can you? Well, funny enough, actually, some people do. I do think some people come to terms with it over massive amounts of time. I'd love to speak to Zuckerberg. Sounds really bad, but on his deathbed, like when he's like really, really old, and be like, do you think after everything, it was for the best? Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Because you get like a more balanced perspective at that point. Like, like you kind of like, when he's in it and his incentive is to keep it going, it's completely different. People keep their mouth shut until they're out of the industry. Like, do you get what I mean? They keep their mouth shut. Like, you know, like Hollywood people as well. They'll be keeping their mouth shut whilst they're still in acting and stuff. And at the end, they might sit back and go, actually, by the way, these people are dicks. These people are dicks. Like, this is like a horrible industry to be in, etc. But like the whistleblowers come out usually when they finally decided they're not willing to be in the thing anymore.
When there's less risk now, you know? Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah. Well, so moving on then. Paradoxically, fanatical conspiracy thinking exacerbates the issue by overshadowing more nuanced analyses and subjecting them to stigmatization. They are unfairly grouped together and dismissed. Thus, conspiracy thinking can either stem from mass formation and serve as an interpretation of it, or contribute to the emergence of mass formation in itself. If any unseen force operates in the background, it is not necessarily secret societies, but rather ideologies. There is a guiding and organizing entity, but it primarily consists of prevailing mindset and ideology, rather than a coordinated and planned conspiracy of elites managing the world. As Charles Eisenstein eloquently put it, events are indeed orchestrated in the direction of more and more control, but the orchestrating power is itself a zeitgeist, an ideology, a myth, not a conspiracy.
So yeah, just a quick one on this one. It kind of reminds me a lot of the stuff I was reading recently about the economics and like the price of time and stuff. And it's funny because they talk a lot about this idea of the Keynesian economics, which is like a zeitgeist in itself, an ideology of the way economics is thought about, which has led to the government policies that have come about as well, which is so interesting. It's like, don't look at the people making individual decisions, because at the end of the day, they're following the worldview and mindset behind those decisions, and therefore you can almost predict relatively what they're going to do because they believe this like the mindset, this model, whatever you want to call it. I think that's so like super interesting if you think about it, because it means you can predict quite a lot of things to some degree, and then you can also see when the mindsets shift and stuff, and then you think, oh wow, there's going to be a brand new, like, there's a new consciousnness born in the world. Now we're going to go a different direction, right? To some degree, if that makes sense to you, because part of, I guess, this book as well is arguing that now we've seen this like a zeitgeist or a mindset towards intervention within society, greater good thinking, protecting the people kind of thing. And obviously, if you take that protecting the people too far, eventually you get, what we got, like mollycoddled people, scared of being insulted, scared of this, because all we're trying to do is protect all the time. And by protecting, we're causing more damage, because then people don't have that anti-fragility to like rebound back from any sort of stressors. I think it's what Taleb calls it. But there's no stresses in our environment anymore.
Yeah.
In fact, there is actually technically is chronic stress caused by eating shit food and stuff. You know what I mean? So there is stresses, but it's the wrong form, and there's no sort of bounce back from them. So but it's the ideology that all stresses can be controlled and like made more comfortable, right? Or like by eradicated. That's it. Like, because there will like somebody and not be yourself as well. Like so, like there's this idea. Obviously, we were just toying with this individuality, like who's responsible? Is the individual responsible? So funny enough, the individual is responsible when people are inflicting harm for addiction and stuff, but at the same time, then like we need to have this idea that these people also can't help us, because if we then put everything onto the system and stuff, we have no individual responsibility in my head to come back and forge yourself, if that makes sense. Because I can see why they blame it on the individual, and the individual does have to have some say in creating their reality to some respect, because otherwise it becomes all about like, oh, my situation's shit, the system needs to help me. If that makes sense, rather than myself.
And you do get that quite a lot now. It's almost an entitlement to assume that I should be looked after. These stresses shouldn't exist, but it's like, it's not how life works. I mean,
Cool. So to finish the chapter, are there any solutions? So the problem at hand cannot be resolved solely through the violent removal of an evil elite. The core issue of totalitarianism lies within the immense dynamics of the masses. Therefore, eliminating totalitarian leaders would yield little result, as they can easily be replaced without destabilizing the system. An alternative strategic approach to breaking the grip of mass formation could be considered, substituting one objective anxiety with another. Mass formation arises when formless and unanchored anxiety attaches itself to a specific object. This bond can be broken if a different object capable of instilling even greater anxiety is presented. Additionally, another option is to challenge the mechanistic worldview and propose a more comprehensive and dynamic perspective, which leads us into part 3.
Yes, indeed. The living beyond the mechanistic worldview. Chapter 9, the dead versus the living universe. Rediscovering life's principles. In a purely mechanistic worldview, grounding ethical principles becomes exceedingly challenging, if not impossible. The question arises, why should a human being in a mechanistic universe feel compelled to adhere to ethical rules and principles in their relationship with others? From a purely survival-oriented perspective, the focus shifts towards being the fittest in the struggle for existence. In this context, ethics and principles may appear as hindrances rather than virtues. Enlightenment thinking, in particular, emphasized the pursuit of efficient strategies for navigating this struggle based on objective knowledge of the world, rather than adherence to commandments, prohibitions, or moral principles. And just a point on that, like, it's quite interesting how even evolutionary thinking on things is somewhat, like, obviously it's amazing, and it's provides a way of thinking about, well, from a survival perspective. But also it's somewhat limiting because it doesn't take into a lot of consideration about how much we need one another. I mean, even when we read the Origins of Virtue, and it just talked about how, or The Cultural Animal, and says like how much we need each other, how much we're dependent.
The reason why we're at the pinnacle of like the food chain is because of the power of cooperation, right? Like it isn't any other way. Like you by yourself, even with a spear, maybe even with a gun, isn't really that great against a lion. Yeah. But also it takes a bunch of people to create the products which create the
exactly.
The lion. Therefore it's our superpower is the cooperation.
You know? Yeah, 100%. And it's almost like we've adopted that kind of, we've adopted the survival oriented perspective, but not so much the collaborative one as much. And
the survival of the most collaborative.
Yeah.
Doesn't have the same ring to it. But it literally is. Like it's survival of the most collaborative. You're right. No, 100%.
Yeah. Interesting. It is perhaps one of humanity's greatest tasks to unveil the timeless principles that underlie life amid the complexities of existence. The more we attune ourselves to these principles, the deeper our understanding of the essence of life becomes, and the more we sense our connection with the majestic, ordering principles that resonate throughout the universe.
So now a little side note, I think we brought it up a bit earlier about chaos theory. So chaos theory, considered the third major scientific revolution of the 20th century, challenges the mechanistic worldview of science. It suggests that the phenomena previously seen as lifeless and predictable actually possess elements of life or consciousness. For example, noise on telephone lines was discovered to be self-organizing and purposeful, revealing a deeper level of complexity. These findings point to a more interconnected and dynamic understanding of the world beyond traditional reductionist approaches. Do you want me to continue this bit, or?
Yeah, just quickly, like a random drawing parallel. When I read that book, Deep Nutrition, she was talking about beauty and like natural beauty, and how basically every living organism almost has like a trajectory that it's going in, and it can kind of be formatted in the Fibonacci sequence, like the golden ratio, and that can be almost applied to everything. And when it's at its like peak health, and it replicates this kind of ratio. People who
there's
aren't
like a natural order of like a natural rhythm, or what's the word, like formation. Maybe.
Yes,
like
absolutely.
A natural formation constrained. Yeah, okay.
However, within that, it also it's dynamic. So it applies. So it's not like everyone's face has to fit exactly. Look in a particular way. It takes the like characteristics of their face and molds it to this ratio, right? So you have this formation, this natural formation, but it is also independent of every kind of unique thing. And that it kind of is like the chaos theory. Like there are patterns within it, but within those patterns, there's also kind of room for fluidity and like unpredictability.
On a quick note on that, I remember somebody saying obviously symmetrical faces were the most attractive, but I remember somebody actually saying the opposite, where it's like symmetrical, yes, but then with slight variations. It's like symmetrical, but then with slightly changed. So you have like the underlying pattern, but then you have the slight individuality to it, to some degree. Because if it was so symmetrical, it'd almost be devoid of personality, devoid of life, like you're saying, because it's just the actual formula, not the formula plus the creation.
Exactly.
Of like DNA or whatever. Yeah.
And that's almost
really
like what I was seeing when you read this bit, just because it's like there is order, but there's also chaos within the order, and then within that chaos there is order. It's just it's like a cyclical thing.
So
so looking deeper at causation, chaos theory introduces a revolutionary perspective by acknowledging the presence of a final and formal cause in nature. This concept draws from Aristotle's theory of causality, which recognizes 4 types of causes: material, efficient, formal, and final. But isn't it funny that that's Aristotle? I mean, we're going back 2,000 years and we're still talking about it now. Using the analogy of creating a statue, Aristotle explains these causes. The material cause of the statue is the matter from which it is made. Without such matter, no statue. The efficient cause is the movement of the sculptor, who uses chisel and hammer to transform the stone into a statue. The formal cause is the idea or form of the statue as it has taken form in the mind of the sculptor and determines how he will direct his movements. And the final cause is the intention to make a statue, for example, because someone has ordered a statue from the sculptor. In a mechanistic worldview, only the material and efficient causes are typically considered active. The universe is seen as a collective of material particles set in motion, with subsequent events unfolding from its initial movement. However, within this perspective, the existence of a predetermined forms or ideas that influence the unfolding of the material process is not presumed, particularly regarding the development of specific organisms. Chaos theory challenges this limited perspective by recognizing that there is a final cause, a purpose or intention in nature, which influences the complex unfolding of events. It expands our understanding of causation and highlights the significance of formal causes and the underlying order within seemingly chaotic systems. I love that. I think it's really, really good. I resonate with that quite a bit.
Yeah, I quite like the sort of like framework of like material, efficient, formal, final. You could almost write that out for most things you see, but like, what's the material? Okay, whatever the stuff is made out of. What's the efficient? Okay, how did this go about? Like the mechanisms of it happening. The formal cause, what idea is it trying to form in the first place? And then the final cause being like the almost like cultural cause in some degree. Like, what's the intention? Why is this movement even happening in the first place? Right. And it's quite interesting. So a lot of these like the final cause, like you said, it's not actually recognized within physics, and there could be certain areas or like the formal cause, the one above it. Like, is there forms that it's seeking to become? And by the fact that it organizes itself to some degree, there are obviously forms that things are becoming. If that makes sense.
Yes, yeah.
But like DNA and stuff is an instruction for the form.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Is there? Yeah, exactly. It's the discrepancy between like the natural endpoint, or you imposing your agenda or your will onto the how it's evolving. But actually, in its natural state, it's assuming that there is an endpoint rather than you getting to dictate what that endpoint is. It's almost like they're actionable ideas.
Yeah, that's it. So chapter 10, matter and spirit. So I didn't take too many notes on this, but I can't remember if it was a short chapter or not. But anyway, the mechanistic worldview assumes a hierarchical structure in the sciences, where physics is seen as the fundamental level and all other disciplines follow from it. However, this perspective has become obsolete in light of scientific advancements. Quantum mechanics, for instance, challenges the notion that consciousness can be fully explained through material knowledge. It reveals that even elementary particles are influenced by consciousness as observed in experiments. The mechanistic worldview relies on the idea of material particles as objective data from which everything else can be deducted or deduced. However, quantum mechanics demonstrates a different reality. The closer we examine the matter, the more the act of observation itself affects our perception, making it more subjective. This aligns with Heisman's uncertainty principle, suggests that matter, once considered the solid foundation of mechanistic materialism, is essentially a subjective phenomena. The true nature of matter remains unknown. The true nature of matter remains unknown.
Yeah.
It's a bit deep. I don't know if I can get my hand around that.
It's something that I used to... So, do you know who Augustus Comte is? He was kind of like I think he was a physicist or some kind of scientist. Essentially, he created this like hierarchy of sciences. And so at the bottom you had physics and maths, essentially
like the hard sciences or whatever they call it.
The hard sciences, right? And you can think about it as, there is one right answer, but it's very difficult to find that answer. But once you know it, you know that it's 100% causation, right? Then as you go up the hierarchy, you then have like biology and chemistry, and then psychology, and more the like humanitarian subjects. In which case, there are hundreds of factors responsible for a result, but they all have little bits of causation. But it's difficult to establish that. I mean, in psychology, you're essentially doing that. Like, why did he do that behavior? There's 50 different reasons. This one contributes 1%. This one contributes 2%. And so I used to think of sciences like that, but actually this kind of changes the whole foundation of that if, matter changes from subjective perception, when you're observing it, because then that kind of eradicates this whole idea that there is one right answer in physics and maths, and that can't kind of change a little bit, It kind of destabilizes that whole hierarchy and makes it a bit redundant.
No, for sure. I mean, there's also like stuff in the physics that obviously has gone on to produce great explanatory and obviously like practical use.
Of course, yeah.
Like there's certain stuff like with if I believe it's like the way light particles act is like they're a wave at the same time as like as a ray. I can't remember what it is. It's a wave and something else at the same time. Like, well, you there's obviously stuff there that hasn't been sort of figured out, right? So like, and even then, if the quantum mechanics stuff's true, then you're right. It's just that being at the very base, bearing in mind now the base is completely uncertain. How can you be certain of anything above it? It's like
well, there's a lot of argument against quantum mechanics because obviously it tries to predict how atoms, I think, are going to behave and where their endpoint is. But I think there's been studies to show that, for instance, when electrons are like shot through something, I'm butchering that. It makes me sound like some stupid fucking guy who knows nothing about science, which I don't. So, but essentially what they found was that no two atoms or electrons behaved in exactly the same way. And the factor that was influencing its endpoint was the observation. So the observation changed the endpoint of how these like electrons or whatever was kind of being conducted.
But also, so another thing, technically, if everything has like some sort of matter and like gravity and some sort of pull, technically shooting through anything different, slightly different, would cause a different way it moves, because anything is different. Like, do you get what I mean? Like, it's because nothing's equal. If everything was equal, nothing would happen. So therefore, it would never move exactly the same way.
And you could probably never replicate something perfectly.
And I didn't know if it's even the observation, because obviously if you just observe it and it goes two different ways, just doesn't mean like it's your observation, the causation. It was more like the influence of the surrounding area upon doing it twice. I don't know.
It's true. I'm butchering it. It's something.
No, I've heard the thing before where it's like if the when you observe it, it changes because of the observation. It's like, well, yes, but like you're observing it and they might be going through two, like it might look identical, but because you've done something and changed something in advance, the next time you shoot it, it's going to cause something different because it's like, I don't know, I'm also butchering it here, but
there
like,
are other factors that
I just once again, this is just the omnipotence of like human people, like us thinking we can like decide how everything's like, or figure out how everything's fabricated and like know everything, you know. It's just we're trying, but you know, it's seems like a goal that probably might never ever be attained.
I'm happy with that.
I'm fine with that too. So we move on to the 11th and final chapter. So science and truth. Totalitarianism is rooted in the belief that human intellect can be the guiding force in shaping society. It seeks to establish an artificial utopia led by technocrats or experts who, relying on their technical knowledge, strive for a flawlessly functioning societal machine. In this vision, individuals are subordinated to the collective, reduced to mere cogs within the societal mechanism. Technocratic thinking operates on two fronts. It entices people with a promise of a positive vision, offering an artificial paradise that supposedly liberates us from adversity and suffering. Simultaneously, it asserts itself through anxiety, presenting itself as a necessary means to solve problems. This process is accelerated with the emergence of various objects of anxiety in recent times, such as terrorism, climate change, and the coronavirus. Totalitarianism and technocracy present themselves as embodiments of rationality and science. The technocratic ideal promises happiness and good health for the population, or at least the greatest likelihood of achieving them. Through subcutaneous sensors, every biomedical or biochemical change can be monitored and reported. Immediate examination and appropriate treatment can be provided to anyone displaying signs of illness. However, in order to achieve this efficiently, everything must be perpetually exposed to the artificial light of surveillance and government control. I mean, that's pretty scary.
Yeah. And also, just once again, like a stark issue with this is that we're at the mercy of what we can observe. Right? So they get to dictate behavior and like what state you're in based on only their measures that they have that can use to observe things. But what about all the other metrics that we can't get because we can't observe them yet? You know, we can't measure them. It's very limiting. So it's time to accept uncertainty. As a society, we can choose to avoid anxiety and deny our uncertainty, or we can confront our narcissistic fears and embrace the unknown. The first option leads us down a path of seeking solutions in an even more pseudo-scientific ideology, false rationality, illusory certainty, and excessive technological control. This ultimately results in the heightened anxiety, depression, and social isolation. In response, we become even more desperate in our futile attempts to control the uncontrollable. On the other hand, choosing the second path entails societal defiance of anxiety and an acknowledgement that uncertainty is inherent to the human condition. It is through uncertainty that creativity, individuality, and human connection emerge. By embracing uncertainty, society becomes a space where interconnectedness and individual differences thrive rather than succumbing to totalitarian systems that erode individual liberty, extinguishing diversity, and impose a monotonous state identity. I tell you what, off the back of this, I would love to read around previous civilizations that have like fallen and why they've fallen, and whether it's like a similar kind of pattern of getting to this point of following a kind of, you know, safe, comfortable road that is trying to control the uncontrollable until it basically breaks and isn't sustainable anymore. And obviously that could manifest in loads of different ways.
There's a few really good books of that. I think there's like Why Nations Fail. There's like one that's called that. Okay. I would love to know like differently to nations, but like also like empires. Like, because obviously nations, like, empires transgress like nations, don't they? So I'd love to also know the history of the nation states. Man, there's so much. When you start thinking about this stuff, there's just like so much that we don't know, you know.
But it just seems like a kind of almost a universal thing, that like an inevitable pattern that we're constantly tackling throughout within our species of, you know, following comfort and being able to convince ourselves that we can control things. Or I think
human gullibility and believing of experts and stuff has always gone about as well, but like human also belief that they actually know what's up, you know. Like we've always throughout history always believed we knew the explanatory reasons of things, but then over time we've been proven wrong, which obviously is the point of science, right? Over time we're refining these ideas to explain more and more and more, but at the same time we still don't realize that even now there's so much to be explained that we think we've got an answer to, which we don't. I mean, even this physics stuff we were just talking about, there's plenty of like paradoxes that haven't been explained away yet, which means there's like opportunities there for better explanations. And
I guess it's slightly different because obviously this has kind of come about since the Enlightenment period of like, with science. And so maybe prior to that, there was religion that explained all these things. And so there wasn't as much of a mechanistic ideology. So maybe the pattern wasn't as present, but still it's like, it is interesting.
I would actually love to some degree, only if you could ever compare the two like completely separately, but like go back into the mindset of somebody who was obviously born into these times where science didn't exist, the evolutionary theories didn't exist, the mechanistic physics-based theories didn't exist, because your world would be so different to not explain things through these ideas, to explain things more through like, oh, this happened because like it's raining because, and the idea I have is because some god or something, but like that's my actual explanatory reason, and my reality is based upon that. Like I'm sure they're not there actually thinking, oh, I'm wrong. They're thinking that's the way it actually happens. You know what I mean? Actually believing in these things and like being able to compare, like just having it so like, these ideas have gone away from me and like this other ideas here. Do you kind of get what I mean? Because like I said, do ideas have people? Do people have ideas? Whatever. It's like these ideas actually do control you to some degree because they change how I experience reality. Because now that I know that rain is caused by water molecules falling down from the sky that have been caused by the heating of the oceans, etc. Right? It completely changes the difference to like a mysterious all-knowing like form of god who's just like peeing or whatever. It's like so different. Like the whole reality is just so, it's just not as magical, right? Like I'm not saying we should go back to that. There's no like mystery anymore. We feel like I almost feel like we think we've got past this point where there is no more mysteries. Like we've explained it all. Do you know what I mean? Like don't we feel so good like, oh, we know what this is, like the water heats up and it rains, it pisses down on us or whatever, like. But that also could be a theory that could be challenged. I'm sure all these theories could be challenged and be like, actually, hang on a second, that still doesn't explain why there's clouds in the middle of here or whatever, why clouds appear here. Do you know what I mean? There's like, it's
we stop like, at the one reason that we think of.
Because
and
there's
no more
the
mystery to kind of propel us or motivate us.
I'm sure, to us, once again, if these explanations are not causing any harm and at the same time seem to explain it, there is no reason then to search for more explanations, I guess, to some degree.
But at the same time, we should always disprove it.
Yeah, true. No, that's it, actually. Funny enough, the Karl Popper thing is like, don't seek to confirm, seek for the way to disprove it. Because if you disprove it, you've moved yourself forward knowing that that's a false theory and that you need a new one. Exactly. Instead of just regurgitating the same tests which already prove it. So, to finish us off, we got the two last points. So the rise of rhetoric. So Foucault presents an intriguing differentiation between rhetoric and truth. Rhetoric involves attempting to evoke ideas and beliefs in others that the speaker themselves may not genuinely hold. On the other hand, speaking the truth entails sincerely conveying an idea or experience that resides within the speaker, aiming to resonate with the other and evoke a shared understanding. In recent centuries, and particularly in recent decades, rhetoric has increasingly pervaded the public sphere. We have grown accustomed to encountering such rhetoric from politicians, knowing that their election promises are often left unfilled. Over time, the general public has come to accept this reality. Our politicians' discourse during elections serves primarily to persuade rather than accurately reflect their future actions. Similarly, the realm of advertising follows a similar pattern. It is widely recognized that advertisements do not provide an entirely truthful representation of the products being promoted. Only a fool would believe otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, we've touched a lot on rhetoric before, haven't we, during that communication kind of trend. But yeah, it's very true. It's just, you need that kind of honesty to be able to know.
Well, I mean, it's another reason why conspiracy theories have like come so prevalent and stuff is because when you just see widespread lying, it's like, well, if they're lying about this, why wouldn't they be lying about everything? It's
exactly. All right, on to the last point then. Behind the fig leaf. The rationality and humanism of the Enlightenment are in many ways a masquerade and a fig leaf. Strip man of this masquerade and you look into the eyes of irrationality. Look behind the fig leaf of rationality and you will find the ancient human vices. By clinging to rational worldview, we are blinded to our own irrational thinking, allowing it to grow unchecked and assume grotesque forms. However, those who acknowledge the limitations of their intellect tend to become less arrogant and more compassionate, embracing the diversity of others. When the clamor of intellect subsides, they can hear the whispers of life telling its own unique stories. They recognize their own right to have a story too.
I really like that. That's why I looked at it. I thought it was so like poignant, like this idea, especially of like when you remove the fig leaf of rationality, you find the ancient human vices. I was like, that's so true, because like if you look at all the ancient human vices, you know, like gluttony, sloth, sin. Oh, sorry. What is the selfish one? Gluttony, sloth. There's loads of them, isn't there?
There's lust.
Selfish. It's lust. I'll find out. I'm butchering it anyway. But the idea that what I find so funny is because we think we're so rational now, we rationalize these emotional or these inclinations within ourselves, which are
rather than accepting them,
which are bad for us, right? Yeah. Rather than realizing that they're bad for us and sort of like adopting an approach which is like, I'm probably going to behave this way and like improve it, whatever. We literally use rationality as a way of explaining and rationalizing the reasons why we do these things. Yeah. And we put it in a positive spin. We like, once again, wasn't there a point we spoke about ages ago that Peterson was saying that the devil is like or something, the evil form is actually the voice of rationality or something. Well, rationality is the devil in some sense, because it allows you to rationalize the vices.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Like, it was something like that. And I remember that such a good point when I heard it. I was like, do you know what? That makes so much sense. It's like the whispering thing in the back of your head being like, oh, I know this is a bad thing to do, but, and then it gives you a reason, which is the rationality, right? This is the reason why it's acceptable to do this.
Yeah, it's very Carl Jungian, isn't it? The not integrating your shadow, and because you're not integrated, these whispers will come and they will sound more tempting, and you'll try to rationalize and subdue them, but actually they'll always be there. And pretending like we don't have these things, that we don't have these ancient human vices, we're just always at the mercy of them, essentially.
Yeah.
Right? It's like anything. It's like if you try to pretend that they don't exist, then they have more power over you, because you
they're working in the background, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They're working in the background, and you're using your rationality to like pretend they don't exist and cover them up, you know, with like you're covering them up with excuses or explanations. You know,
it's one of the things that I remember Jordan Peterson saying was like, you know, would I refuse my child from going on social media? And he was like, well, the thing is that if you do that, when they eventually go on social media, they'll be at the mercy of social media, because they've never trained their ability to just like put it down or stop using it, right? You have to be able to master the tool. And in this case, it's the same. It's like you need to be able to master your demons so that you've fully integrated them and you're not at the mercy of them.
So yeah, that was the Psychology of Totalitarianism. I mean, we've made it at least probably the best part of like 5 hours and a half.
Yeah,
but we've probably gone in deep. We've explored sort of our takes on all the different things and trying to link it with as many books as we've read that have similar topics. And I think this book is applied to a large variety of other books. It's probably one of the books I thought of the most. That's like being able to like ping pong around a load of different like books. Especially like stuff like Evil and stuff. I mean, if people like this book, they should definitely read Evil. I'm trying to think of the other ones we mentioned. Like The Age of Propaganda is a good one. Another really good one is The Tyranny of Metrics. I don't know if we've done that one on the channel yet, but that's really good. No. It talks a lot about obviously how the misuse. It's basically that chapter called Immeasurable, but on like just a whole book based upon it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because it's talking about an ideology, isn't it? And it's just how that ideology shapes our behavior.
The matter with things, master with history, all of it. Like it's because it's such a big social commentary, like the social warming, that social media book. Also technically lead into this and stuff. So I really enjoy this book. I mean, should we? Is it even possible to take away 3 key takeaways? I guess I'm gonna have a little look and see what we can.
I mean, I would say just it's the structure, isn't it? That like talking about how the Enlightenment period allowed us to go and explore different areas with this kind of scientific lens, but we lost our kind of trajectory and the reason why, and slipped into using science to justify things, and as a result, it kind of manifested this mechanistic ideology, which then set the foundation for a society that, when it has these 4 components, what is it, like a lack of meaning, loneliness, I can't remember the other 2.
I'm going to try and find it for you now.
Yeah. The subdued anxiety, and then there's the last one, which is providing the solution, was it?
It's something along the lines of that. Let me go quickly try and find it for you, man.
And essentially how that can lead to this kind of totalitarian regime, and that's like he was saying, it's different to an authoritarian state because it's not being imposed. Instead, it's come out of this kind of psychological state, like very incrementally. It's like almost grown naturally because it's like had a rotten root and it's grown from there. And then obviously like the solution to that is basically looking at the world through a different kind of ideology, this kind of adopting this kind of chaos theory, and these four components that they were saying, rather than just resorting back to this matter, like looking at matter in particular. And what was the other one? The efficiency, the efficient cause, I think. Yeah. Also taking into consideration the formal cause and the final cause, that just adds a bit more complexity to what you're observing. I would say those are the kind of three key.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add on to that as well is this idea of like doubting numbers and data to some degree. It's kind of like realizing that numbers and data and graphs and all sorts like this can be manipulated in ways depending upon the way the numbers are being calculated in the first place, either via definitions. So like, is the hospital admission defined by somebody who came in with COVID or because of COVID? Like there's a difference between the two, but you can conflate them. So it's basically like whenever you see numbers, it's trying to figure out where they come from, why they're being presented in that way as well. Because sometimes if you think about it, like it wasn't overt lying, so to speak. Let's just say if you're giving a statistic, it could be just like, this is how many people have COVID, like the absolute number, right? But without giving the context of the increase, for example, the increase of testing, you that number doesn't really mean much, if that makes sense.
No,
it's basically, it's almost like the factfulness approach to sort of things, like never take a number by itself. That was another like key takeaway for me from this book. I'm just obviously, like you said, you covered the rest of it. I mean, it's as well, I guess it's just the realization that also with the conspiratorial thinking stuff, it's like it's not necessarily all a conspiracy, but more a bunch of people acting in self-interested ways in systems that have been set up, which we haven't changed, and that will continue to provide the same sort of results because the systems haven't changed, right? And it gives the illusion of maybe like some sort of control because people are making decisions. And I think that's probably what it is more than anything. It's because you have people who make decisions for the collective. You think because they're making these decisions, they actually have choices, and therefore they're like, there's a conspiracy because they have the choices. The reality is a lot of the choices, as we've discovered, are guided by the fact that they believe certain models or beliefs underneath them anyway. But yeah, so that was the Psychology of Totalitarianism. We don't know what we're doing next, which book we're doing next. But be back again with another book summary, kind of on something on a similar topic. I think we were talking about potentially anti-fragile or something to do with economics. The price of time, or I think it was. But
yeah, cool. So if you want to check out the book summary, head on over to wisewords.blog. The actionable ideas should be there as well. And then tune in for next week when we cover another book.
That's it. Hopefully not a 6-hour long one. Right, that's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
Off we go.
Hey guys, well there you have it. We hope you enjoyed that book summary. Now we know it can be a lot to take in all at once, so if you want to be able to read this in a more palatable size, or you want to be able to implement any of those key actionable ideas that we were talking about in this episode, head on over to our website at wisewords.blog, where the book summary will be waiting for you. Also, don't forget to check out our socials, as we consistently upload the key ideas, benefits, and actionable ideas from all the books that we read. The links to those will be in the description below. Now, we want to be able to get you the best content in a way that's really easy to understand, but we need your help. Your opinion matters. So you are our feedback mechanism. And with those quick actions, whether that's leaving us a like or a dislike, commenting in the comment section below, or subscribing to our channel, all of those help us gauge what we're doing well and how to improve on our method of delivery. So if you have any thoughts on the matter, don't hesitate to act. It takes less than 10 seconds and it really helps us out. But with all that being said, until next time, stay wise.